People still look at me and think, she's just a middle-class widow, living quietly in her small suburban house. I don't deny it, nor do I hurry to explain. Sometimes, letting others think simply of you feels more comfortable than truth. I've never been used to showing off or telling stories. Ever since my husband, Richard, passed away early, I've learned to live neatly, manage on my own, and pour all my love into my daughter, Laura. I keep a simple lifestyle, not because of poverty, but because I believe peace of mind matters more than anything else. Instead of shopping or flaunting, I quietly send money to where it's needed: a poor school in the next town, a few young families struck by accidents, hot meals for the homeless. No one knows I'm behind it, except Nancy, my dear old friend who always accompanies me, listening to my confessions. Even Laura has never heard the whole story. I want her to grow up like any other child, to understand the value of work, not lean on her mother's shadow. Yet the closer Laura's wedding day comes, the more unsettled I feel. Perhaps because throughout my youth, I dreamed of this moment, the moment of watching my daughter step into a new life. I want her to have a solid beginning, not to struggle the way Richard and I once did. If you're watching this video, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd be so happy to connect with you. One evening, as the two of us sat on the sofa, I decided to speak up. I told her I had prepared a small house, already in her name, and I wanted to give it to the couple as a wedding gift. I still remember how my hands trembled, fiddling with the document, afraid she might think I was interfering too much in her life. Laura was silent for a few seconds. She looked at me, her eyes gentle yet firm. Then she held my hand and whispered, "Mom, it's not the right time. I want Brian to know he loves me for who I am, not for a house or any amount of money. I believe we can manage on our own." I was stunned. Inside me rose both pride and a flicker of fear. I saw myself in my younger days, stubborn and proud in just the same way. But hearing Laura's voice, I knew she had truly grown. "You'll have a harder time, Laura," I murmured, more as a warning than a reproach. She smiled softly, a smile both tender and strong. "I know, but I want to walk on my own 2 feet." That night, I couldn't sleep. I placed the property deed back into the wooden box, locked it carefully, and sat for a long time by the window. Outside, the street lamp cast a pale golden light on the empty street. I thought, being a mother sometimes means learning to keep silent, learning to wait. The time will come to pass on what I've safeguarded, but not today. The next morning, as sunlight spilled into the living room, I felt my heart ease. The wedding would take place, and I needed to let Laura walk the path she had chosen, no matter how rough, no matter how hard. The wedding that day was truly simple, just as Laura had wished. A small hall, a few rustic bouquets of fresh flowers, tables and chairs covered with plain white cloths, but nothing elaborate. I sat in the front row, my heart both swelling with joy and shadowed with unease. Laura walked in, wearing the wedding dress she had picked herself from a modest shop. No sparkling beads, no sweeping train. Yet when she smiled at Brian, the whole room seemed to brighten. To me, at that moment, Laura was the most beautiful in the world. Guests smiled, cheered, and offered congratulations. But I still caught whispers from behind. "The bride looks gentle, probably just works in some office. Such a plain wedding. I thought her family was better off." I pretended not to hear. Laura had said she wanted to begin a normal life, so I had to let things unfold as she wished. But a mother's heart is not always so easily at peace in the crowd. Jeanette's gaze, Brian's mother, pierced me sharply. She sat upright, hands neatly folded on her lap, her eyes scrutinizing Laura's every move. It wasn't the affectionate gaze of a mother-in-law, but one measuring whether the bride was truly worthy of their family. I caught that look several times, cold and doubtful, when the minister read the vows. Brian held Laura's hand, his voice trembling with emotion. Laura smiled through glistening eyes and softly replied, "I do." The hall erupted in applause. I clapped too, tears streaming down my cheeks. But out of the corner of my eye I saw Jeanne frown ever so slightly. After the ceremony, guests gathered around the simple tables. The meal was roasted chicken, salad, and a few bottles of cheap wine. Everyone was cheerful, talking and laughing. Brian moved constantly, greeting people, while Laura gently shook hands with each guest, her smile never fading. Watching my daughter, I silently thanked Richard, her father, for leaving me with the strength to raise her into the woman she had become. When it was my turn to take a picture with the newlyweds, Laura hugged me tightly and whispered, "Mom, I'm truly happy." I gently stroked her hair. "As long as you smile like this, I'll be at peace." In the frame, Jeanne also stood beside us. Her smile was fleeting, forced, and her eyes remained cold. I knew this photograph would not capture a harmonious family, but rather the beginning of a journey full of trials. I didn't say it out loud, only kept it to myself. My daughter's happiest day was also the day her test began. After the wedding, I thought Laura and Brian would rent a small apartment to start on their own. But not long after, I heard they had decided to move in with Jeanne. Brian said it would help save money, and Laura, wanting to support her husband, agreed. When my daughter told me, I stayed silent for a long while. I knew newlywed life would not be easy, especially when living under the same roof with a mother-in-law. But Laura seemed to believe that as long as she was tactful, everything would be fine. I didn't want to add more worry, so I only reminded her, anywhere is fine, as long as you both respect each other. On the first day of moving in, Laura called me, her voice still full of excitement. Jeanette's house was quite spacious, the living room bright, the kitchen tidy. "Mom, I think it'll be fine," she laughed. "A little cramped, but we'll call it a beginning." Hearing her, I felt both relieved and faintly uneasy. Laura continued working as before, an office job with just enough salary. She wanted to share the expenses, not let Brian carry it all. In the mornings, she woke earlier than usual to prepare breakfast, then hurried off to catch the bus to work. In the evenings, after returning home, she helped wash the dishes, spent time with Brian, then tidied their room. Her voice over the phone always tried to sound cheerful, but sometimes I could hear the fatigue behind it. What worried me most was Jeanne. She had always been known as strict, and since Laura entered the house, she seemed to see it as her duty to train her daughter-in-law. "Laura," Jeanne often said, "a good wife doesn't let her husband worry about the house. You work all day like that, how do you still have time to care for Brian?" My daughter told me this with a tone that mixed bitterness and patience. Laura never argued, but she knew how to answer without lowering herself. Once, she looked Jeanne straight in the eye and smiled. "I believe Brian needs a partner more than someone who only stays in the kitchen. I want to contribute so we can walk together." That reply left Jeanne silent, but it was a heavy silence, not a pleasant one. In the evenings after work, Laura would call me. Some nights her voice trembled, breaking as she spoke. "Mom, I'm trying so hard, but every word from her feels like a reminder that I'll never be enough." I could only listen, then reassure her, "You don't need to prove yourself to anyone. Just live true to your heart. I believe Brian will understand. I knew it was easy to say, but living in that environment was another matter. From a mother's perspective, I realized repeated words of scorn don't just exhaust someone. They cut into faith like little blades. Laura was strong, but she was still just a young woman at the start of marriage. One evening, as I was making tea, the phone rang. It was Laura. I heard Jeanette's laughter echoing in the background. Laura whispered, as if afraid someone might overhear, "Mom, I'm okay, but sometimes I feel like I have no place in this house." I sat silently for a long while, gripping my hot teacup tightly. I wished I could be right beside her, shielding her like when she was a child. But I knew there are battles my daughter must face on her own. Laura was not the type of daughter to be fragile. I knew that well. She was my child. Since she was young, Laura had her own way of facing criticism. Never loud, never explosive, but her gaze and her attitude were so steady that no one could dismiss her. Once, Laura told me Jeanne scolded her for coming home late, leaving dinner cold. Brian was washing dishes, not paying attention, but Jeanne didn't let it go. A good wife should know to put family before work. You work all day, then come home and make everyone wait. What does that say? Laura set her bag down, calmly hung her coat, and only then smiled. I'm sorry for being late, but if I quit my job, who will take care of these bills? I think Brian deserves a wife who shares the load, not just someone who stands in the kitchen. She told me. Jeanne fell silent, her face darkening, while Brian avoided both of their eyes. Another time, Jeanne commented on how Laura treated her husband. Brian works so hard. You should pamper him more. A man needs to feel like he's the center of the family. Laura didn't get angry. She poured a cup of tea, set it on the table in front of Jeanne, and said, I agree, but I also believe a good family is one where both are at the center. I want Brian to know he doesn't just have a wife, he has a partner. When Laura recounted this, I smiled, but my heart ached. I knew my daughter was straining herself each day to keep her tone calm, while inside she must have been full of resentment. Her phone calls to me often came at night. At first, her voice tried to sound steady, but then it faltered. I heard her sighs, and sometimes the quiet fall of tears on the other end. Mom, I don't want to argue. I just want to prove that I'm worthy too. But sometimes it's so exhausting. I gripped the receiver tightly, not knowing what to say beyond simple words of comfort. You're not alone. I'm still here, whenever you need me. After each conversation, I would sit in the kitchen for a long time, with only the ticking clock for company. I wished Richard were still alive, so we could share the weight of supporting our daughter. But now, it was only me, and I had to be strong for both of us, despite the pressure. Laura never backed down. I realized she was no longer the little girl who used to cry easily. She had become a woman who knew how to hold her ground. That very attitude, I understood, would only make Jeanne more irritated. Laura told me that once, during a meal, Jeanne made a cutting remark. If it weren't for this house, the two of you wouldn't have lasted. Laura set her chopsticks down, looked straight ahead, and replied softly but firmly, Brian and I can start over anywhere. We're not afraid of hardship. I just want our family to enjoy dinner together. The table went silent. Brian coughed lightly, pretending to ladle more soup. Jacob chirped something, breaking the tension. But Jeanne frowned, lips pressed tightly. When Laura told me about it, I could picture the moment vividly. A quiet pride rose in me. My daughter had learned to stand up for herself not by shouting or pounding the table, but simply by holding her voice steady. I knew Jana surely realized Laura would not be easily subdued, and that would only make the days ahead even more strained. The news of Laura's pregnancy came to me on an April morning. She called, her voice still trembling. "Mom, I think I have good news." I froze for a few seconds. Then tears just poured out. In all my decades of being a mother, I had never felt my heart so overwhelmed. I congratulated her, my voice shaking as if I were the one receiving the news. But before the joy could be complete, I began to worry. Laura still went to work regularly, leaving in the morning and returning in the evening, with no intention of resting. I advised her, "Laura, at least you should reduce your working hours. You have to keep your strength for both of you." She laughed. "Mom, I'm fine. I want to keep working, so later I can proudly tell my child that their mother worked until just before they were born." I knew my daughter wasn't only thinking about the paycheck. She wanted to prove that women can still be resilient, no matter the circumstances. Jana didn't see it that way. One time when Laura came home later than usual, Jana remarked bitterly, "A proper wife should stay home to take care of her husband and children. If you keep running around like this, when the baby comes it'll only be Brian who suffers." Laura told me she had stopped on the stairs, took a deep breath before replying. She wasn't harsh, nor did she let it slide. She only smiled, lifted her head. "I want my child to grow up proud that their mother didn't give up. I believe a child will be stronger if they see both parents striving together." Hearing that, I was speechless. I pictured my daughter standing in Jeanette's kitchen, her hand resting on her belly, her voice firm. I felt both tenderness and admiration. I remembered the years when Laura was little. In second grade, she once stood up to protect a smaller classmate who was being bullied in the schoolyard. At that moment, I realized my child would never back down from injustice. And now, even while carrying a tiny life within her, she still refused to be belittled. In the following months, Laura kept working while also preparing everything for the baby herself. She called me, telling me she had bought a few baby outfits with her own savings. I offered to send more, but she insisted. "I want to prepare it myself, Mom. I want everything to come from my and Brian's effort." Every time I heard Laura's voice, I felt a new faith in my heart. I knew she would face pressure, but I also knew the baby inside her would grow together with that strength. Even so, the worry pressed on quietly. I couldn't be by her side every day. Everything I knew came from phone calls, sometimes her voice radiant, sometimes whispering at night, surely with red eyes. I learned to listen without interfering too much, because I understood Laura wanted to write her own journey. I only prayed silently that Laura's determination would be enough to shield her from bitter words, and enough for Brian to truly see the value of his wife. When I learned Laura was pregnant, I began gathering the small items I had kept for many years. A few baby outfits I had bought when I was younger, thinking one day they would be used. A wool blanket I had wear upon with my own hands on long winter nights. I packed everything into a cardboard box and sent it to Laura by post. The day she received it, she called me right away, her voice emotional. "Mom, thank you. But please, let me prepare my own share. I want Brian to see that we are not relying on anyone." I was silent for a few seconds, then gently replied, "I understand, but remember, whenever you need, I am always here." Laura laughed, a smile both sweet and proud. I heard her breathing slow, as if to steady herself in those days. Laura kept working right up until the final month. She told me that once, sitting on the bus with her hand on her belly, She felt the baby move. She was tired yet happy, and felt every effort was worthwhile. I could only listen, picturing my daughter thinner than before, but with eyes that surely still shone. At first, Brian didn't pay much attention to this, but gradually, he began to look at Laura differently. One evening, Laura told me over the phone that Brian had placed his hand on her belly and whispered, "I truly admire you. You work, you care for the family, and you're still so strong." I choked up hearing that. It was the first time I felt Brian truly understood the value of his wife, not just seeing the responsibilities on Laura's shoulders. Even so, Jana did not easily accept it. She kept her habit of mocking whenever she had the chance. Seeing Brian begin to lean more toward Laura's words only made Jana more displeased. One afternoon, the whole family was having tea. Laura had just come back from work, sweat still on her forehead. Brian stood up to pour her a drink. Jana watched, her eyes darkening. She gripped the glass in her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Laura told me that Jana said nothing, only sat in silence with her lips pressed tight. But that silence itself made the whole room icy. Brian soon shifted away, trying to talk about work, while Laura bowed her head to gently stroke her belly, hiding the sadness in her eyes. Hearing my daughter recount this pierced my heart. I knew Jana was feeling it clearly. Laura was not the kind of daughter-in-law to be easily controlled or obedient to lectures. Day by day, she was proving she had enough strength to stand on her own, and that truth made Jana more irritated than ever. Deep down, I believed this challenge was only the beginning, but watching the way Laura faced it, I also understood. My daughter had grown beyond anything I had ever hoped for. The day Jacob was born, I stood outside the delivery room, my trembling hands clutching my handbag. The baby's first cry pierced through the silence, and tears streamed down my face. I had thought I was familiar with the happiness of being a mother, but the feeling of becoming a grandmother was entirely different, tender, yet aching. Laura lay on the hospital bed, drenched in sweat, but her face glowed as she held her child in her arms. Brian stood beside her, his eyes both bewildered and full of pride. I gently touched Jacob's tiny hand, and my heart swelled with a quiet gratitude. In the first months, Laura took time off work to focus entirely on caring for the baby. She told me that each night she woke 3 or 4 times to feed Jacob, her body exhausted but still forcing a smile whenever he stirred. I remember once calling, and on the other end of the line I heard only soft breathing mixed with the baby's cries. Laura spoke softly, her voice weary yet joyful. "Mom, I never knew I could be this patient. Even without sleep, when I look at Jacob, everything feels worth it." During the first year, the family managed thanks to Brian's meager savings and Laura's frugality. But when Jacob turned 1, that money was nearly gone. Laura decided to return to work, though I knew her body had not yet fully recovered. "I don't want to be dependent, Mom," she said over the phone. "I need to contribute, not just for my child, but for my own self-respect." So each morning, Laura dropped Jacob off at daycare before rushing to the office. An office salary was never much, but now it felt even smaller faced with endless expenses. Milk, diapers, medicine, daycare fees. Just the frequent minor illnesses, coughs, fevers, sore throats were enough to make their already tight budgets suffocating. Brian fared no better. To make up for it, he took extra shifts, often coming home late with a gaunt face. Laura told me that many nights she woke to Jacob's cries, only to glance over and see her husband asleep on the sofa, still in his work clothes, carrying the smell of the construction site. I sat in my small kitchen, holding the phone, listening to my daughter's sighs with a heavy heart. I wanted to send money, to shoulder part of the burden, but Laura always refused. She feared Brian would feel as though they were living under my shadow. Once during a call, I heard Jacob's rattling cough in the background. Laura soothed him while saying, "Medicine for children is so expensive, Mom, but I'll manage somehow." I could only bite my lip, not daring to offer more help, because I knew that proud look in her eyes. Every word Laura shared felt like a blade cutting into my heart. I knew that being a parent means learning to stand aside, letting your child fight their own battles in life. But my heart, the heart of a mother, was never that simple. Brian began taking on more shifts. By day at the company, by night working overtime. Some weeks he only came home after midnight, his body reeking of sweat and dust. Laura told me that many times Brian collapsed right on the sofa, without even a proper dinner. "He's gotten so thin, Mom," Laura whispered over the phone. I pictured his gaunt face, sunken eyes. I knew Brian was trying, but human strength cannot last forever. That hardship should have drawn the household closer together. But Jana was different. She saw it as an opportunity to emphasize her favor. One evening, after Laura had just put Jacob to bed, Jana stepped into the kitchen, her voice sharp. "If it weren't for this house, the two of you wouldn't have survived. Think about it, Brian bears everything alone. And what have you done?" Laura told me. She stood still for a few seconds, feeling each word like a needle pricking her pride. But instead of crying or arguing, she turned, her voice slow yet steady. "I'm grateful we can stay here, but don't forget, I'm contributing too. I won't let anyone dismiss my efforts, even if they're small." Brian, who had just walked in, heard it but only bowed his head in silence. Perhaps he was too exhausted to speak. That silence, Laura said, was sometimes heavier than any mockery. When she told me, Laura's voice broke. I could hear her swallowing back tears on the other end. "Mom, I'm so tired, but I won't let her look down on me. I have to hold on to my self-respect." I clutched the phone, my throat tight. So many times I wanted to say, "Come home with me, Laura. I'll take care of you and Jacob." But I knew she would refuse. Laura had chosen this path, the path she believed would preserve her love with Brian. I sat quietly after that call, listening to the ticking clock in my familiar kitchen. Part of me wanted to rush to her side immediately, but another part whispered, "Let her prove herself." Laura was strong, and I believed that determination would shield her from cruel words. But at the same time, I also knew that the storms in that house showed no sign of stopping. I still remember vividly the time Laura called me, her voice heavy as though she had just endured a long day. "Mom, I think he's starting to change." She left the sentence hanging, and the silence that followed tightened my chest. In recent months, Brian had clearly been worn down. Overloaded work and night shifts had taken a toll on his health. Every time Laura told me, I imagined my young son-in-law, hunched under the dim light of the living room, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Instead of finding sympathy at home, Brian received whispered words from Jana. Laura said many times. Passing the kitchen, she overheard her voice. "You're carrying the whole family. While she does so little, a man needs more than that, Brian." At first Brian brushed it off, but weariness made those words seep in. One evening, at dinner, he let out a remark that left Laura frozen. "I work myself to exhaustion, while you hardly help at all." Laura set her chopsticks down, calmly looked straight at her husband. She told me she didn't scream, didn't cry, only spoke firmly. "At least I'm contributing." Do you think my efforts have no value? I work. I care for Jacob. I keep this family from falling apart. If you don't see it, it's because you refuse to look. Brian fell silent, eyes lowered to his bowl, while Jana sat with arms crossed, a flicker of satisfaction in her gaze. Hearing Laura recount it, my heart ached. I knew she was strong, but those harsh words must have cut deeply. I wondered, could love withstand the erosion of faith when careless remarks take root? Laura said that after that meal, she went upstairs and sat alone beside Jacob for a long time, watching her son sleep. She promised herself she would not let him grow up in a home filled only with reproach. Laura's voice on the phone sank low, yet carried resolve. I did not hear despair. Instead, I heard a will being forged. After hanging up, I sat quietly for a while. I knew that young family was standing at an unpredictable crossroads, and my daughter, once again, had to learn to hold herself firm, not to be swept away. The first quarrel between Laura and Brian happened on a night of heavy rain. Laura called me the next morning, her voice hoarse, surely from crying through the night. She told me that Brian had come home late, his shirt soaked, his steps heavy. Laura handed him a towel, urging him to sit and rest. But Brian snapped with a sharp, cold line. I'm tired of carrying everything. You're just another burden. Laura said, her heart clenched. She had endured so much, but that night she could no longer hold back. She sat up straight, looked at her husband, her voice calm yet firm. Do you think everything in this house is done by you alone? I work every day. I care for our child every hour. I keep this home in order so you can rest. Do you even realize that? Brian lifted his head, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his tone harsh. But you don't earn enough to make a difference. I'm the one holding this house together. Laura did not shout, but each word came out clear. Money isn't the only thing that holds a family together. You don't see what I do because you refuse to look. If you value only a paycheck, then you are belittling both of us. The room sank into silence. Jacob cried out in his crib, shattering the tense air. Brian turned away, grabbed his coat, and slammed the door shut. Hearing my daughter recount this, my heart ached. I knew Laura was facing the moment every marriage must confront when love is tested by the weight of daily survival. As a mother, I longed to shield her, but I also heard in her voice a maturity I had never heard before. She wasn't weeping or complaining. She knew how to stand up for herself. I'll be fine, Mom, Laura said, her voice hoarse but resolute. I don't want him to look down on me. I need to show him just how strong I am. I sat by my old phone, my hands trembling, torn between pain and a flicker of pride. My daughter was no longer the little girl she once was. She had become a woman who knew how to guard her own worth, even in the middle of a storm. But in another corner of the house, Jeanette's reaction was entirely different. Laura said that after Brian stormed out, her mother-in-law walked into the living room, saw her cradling Jacob. Instead of offering comfort, she only curled her lips into a faint smile and nodded slightly as if what she had long awaited had finally come true. In that moment, Laura realized her mother-in-law believed she had sown the seed of division in her small family. I could no longer sit still and watch my daughter carry everything alone. After the quarrel, Laura's voice on the phone still tried to remain calm, but I could hear the fatigue seeping through every word. Brian was exhausted, Jacob was still small, and Jana was becoming harsher by the day. How could one woman endure so much? One afternoon, I pulled from an old wooden box a stack of savings books. The numbers inside were enough to help Laura and Brian escape their struggles. I sat for hours, holding the passbook in my hand, asking myself if it was time to reveal the truth I had kept hidden for so long. When Laura called, I gathered all my courage and said, "Laura, let me help. I have some money. I can help you to pay off some debts. Make things easier for Jacob. Don't refuse any more." On the other end, there was silence for a long while. Then Laura's voice came, firmer than ever. "Mom, I know you mean well, but if Brian finds out, he'll think this love is just a debt. I don't want that. I want him to believe we can stand on our own." I choked up, left with nothing but listening. For a moment, I felt both powerless and proud. Powerless because I couldn't protect my daughter the way I wanted, but proud because she had grown enough to guard both her love and her dignity. I softly said, "I understand, but remember, you will always have a place to come back to." Laura didn't answer right away, only sighed, then switched to telling me about Jacob. I knew she wanted to close that conversation, at least for now. But things didn't stop there. Brian began to show signs of suspicion. He wasn't usually observant, but lately, under the weight of pressure, anything unusual became a concern. Laura told me that once Brian happened to pick up a local newspaper with an article praising an anonymous benefactor who had donated a large sum to a hospital. Though the donor's name wasn't given, the way the money was allocated matched the rumors Brian had once heard. "Strange," Brian said to his wife, his eyes probing. "I heard somewhere that your mother might be involved. Do you know anything about this?" Laura quickly dodged. "It must just be coincidence. You know my mom, she lives simply. Nothing but that old house. What makes you think?" Brian didn't reply, but his face was full of doubt. Laura told me it was the first time she saw her husband look at her, as though there was an invisible distance between them. I sat silently after hearing the story. The secret I had guarded all these years was starting to be threatened. And what worried me wasn't the money being discovered, but that Laura's love might falter if the truth were exposed at the wrong moment. Laura told me that in recent days, Jana had begun to change the way she spoke. No longer sharp public remarks, but seemingly casual questions, repeated during meals or while the two of them tittied up. "Laura, does your mother really live only on that tiny pension? I've heard she's connected to many people in charitable funds." Or sometimes, when Brian had just left, Jana would slowly drop a line. "Someone told me there's a widow in the next town who quietly donates money to the hospital. From the description, she sounds a lot like Susan. Do you know anything about that?" Laura told me she only gave a faint smile and tried to change the subject. "It's probably just rumors. You know my mom, she lives a very simple life." But Jana wasn't so easy to dismiss. The way she looked at her daughter-in-law seemed as if she was trying to uncover a hidden secret. Hearing this pierced my heart. The secret I had kept for so long was no longer safe. I only feared that if it came out twisted, Laura would be the first to bear all suspicion. I told Nancy about it one afternoon as we sat together on the old chair on the porch. My old friend shook her head, her voice low. "Susan, sooner or later it will come out. No secret lasts forever, especially when there are people around her just waiting." I sighed, looking out at the front garden where the chrysanthemum bushes were in bloom. "I know, Nancy, but if that day comes, I want it to happen under the right circumstances. I don't want Laura or Brian to think their love is weighed down by a gift from me." Nancy placed her hand on my shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You can't control everything, but at the very least, you can prepare Laura, so she won't be too shocked." Nancy's words troubled me all night. I sat alone at the table, turning the savings book over and over, thinking of the years I had spent building it, and the reason I had chosen to live in hiding. I didn't do it for gratitude, but so Laura could live the life she chose for herself. The very next day, Laura called me. Her voice was weary, as though she had just endured another long day facing Jeanne and her piercing questions. But beneath that fatigue, I heard determination in every word she spoke. Mom, I won't let anyone turn this love into a debt. No matter how hard it gets, I will stand firm. I gripped the phone tightly, listening to my daughter's voice, my heart aching yet swelling with an indescribable pride. Laura called me that evening, her voice steady but with weariness beneath it. Mom, I think I just made the family dinner more tense than ever. She said the whole family was eating dinner, Jacob sitting in his high chair, waving his spoon and scattering rice across the table. Brian laughed, quickly bending down to clean, while Laura took the chance to feed Jacob another small spoonful. The meal seemed ordinary until Jeanne spoke, her voice cold but clear. If it weren't for this house, you two wouldn't have survived. Don't forget, everything depends on me. The whole room went silent. Brian froze, the spoon in his hand suspended before it reached his bowl. Laura said she could feel her heart pounding, but her face remained calm. She turned and looked straight at her mother-in-law. If Jeanne thinks that way, then Brian and I can rent somewhere else. I'm not afraid to start over. The only thing I need is a family that respects one another. That statement froze the dinner table. Brian looked at his wife, his eyes a mix of confusion and surprise. Jacob suddenly burst out laughing, his childish giggles ringing out in the heavy atmosphere, but not enough to erase the tension. Laura said that afterwards, no one spoke another word. Brian lowered his head and kept eating. Jeanne clenched her chopsticks tightly, her eyes darkened. Laura quietly fed Jacob, her hands steady, as though she had just made the most important declaration of her life. Hearing my daughter's story, I felt both choked up and faintly worried. I knew Laura had crossed a crucial line. She no longer endured humiliation in silence. She dared to stand up for herself. But I also understood that from that moment on, Jeanne would no longer see her simply as a difficult daughter-in-law, but as a true adversary. When Laura called me after that dinner, her voice trembled slightly, but each word rang with firmness. I sat in my familiar kitchen, pressing the receiver to my ear, clearly feeling the change in my daughter. Mom, I spoke straight to her. I couldn't let those words keep repeating forever. I never meant to provoke, but I also won't allow anyone to dismiss everything I've tried for. My heart tightened as I listened. Part of me wanted to hold her, shield her from every cruelty, but another part swelled with pride. She had grown more than I ever imagined, brave enough not to bow to mockery. Laura went on, saying that right after she finished speaking. The dense atmosphere in the dining room made even breathing feel heavy. Brian kept his head down, fumbling with the soup ladle just to avoid the gaze of the two women. Jacob, sensing the tense silence, suddenly reached out toward his mother, babbling mama before wrapping himself tightly around Laura. That moment was like a tiny ray of light piercing through the darkness. Laura held her son, smiled gently, and tried to keep her voice calm. See? We still have reasons to be happy at this table. But Jeanne sat frozen. She set her chopsticks down on the table, the faint sound enough to make others flinch. Her eyes locked onto Laura, as if she had never imagined her daughter-in-law could openly push back like that. Laura said Jeanne didn't utter another word for the rest of dinner. She just sat there, her face tense, staring at her bowl of rice, lips pressed tightly together. It wasn't the silence of acceptance, it was the silence of someone being challenged. When Laura ended the call, I sat quietly for a long while. I worried for her, yet pride swelled in my chest. My daughter had learned to stand tall, even if it meant paying the price of heavier days ahead. I only silently hoped that, after that moment, Brian would realize the woman he married was not weak as his mother thought. And Jana, perhaps she would have to start seeing Laura with different eyes. There was a small change that Laura noticed first. Brian began speaking less. In the past, after work, even when tired, he would still share a few stories from his day with his wife. But lately, dinner was filled only with the sound of spoons clinking against bowls. While conversation was reduced to awkward fragments, Laura said that many evenings Brian came home late, ate a hurried bowl of rice, then went upstairs, claiming he still had unfinished work. "He doesn't look me straight in the eyes like before, Mom," she said over the phone. I could hear the disappointment, though Laura's voice stayed calm, as if she didn't want me to worry too much. Even with her husband becoming distant, Laura refused to give in. By day, she worked in the office and also took extra jobs after hours to earn more. In the afternoon, she rushed to pick Jacob up from daycare, then hurried home to prepare dinner. On nights when her son was feverish, she stayed awake until morning, yet still dragged herself to the company. "Everything I do," she said, "is not to prove anything to my mother-in-law or to Brian, but to remind myself that I am not lesser." Hearing this, my heart ached, yet swelled with indescribable pride. My daughter had chosen a difficult road, but she walked it with her back straight. I knew Laura would have moments of weakness, but not once had she allowed them to outweigh her resolve. Often, I wanted to intervene, to tell her to rest for a while, or to send her more money to ease the burden. But each time I was about to speak, I remembered Laura's firm, self-respecting tone. I feared that if I stepped in, I would unintentionally shake the faith she was struggling to hold on to. Inside me was a constant struggle. One side the instinct to protect my child, the other the belief that Laura needed to prove herself. And through those long late-night calls, I realized my daughter was growing stronger precisely through her hardship. Laura told me that Jana still hadn't dropped her habit of planting poisonous words. She often chose the exact moments when Brian was present, as if deliberately dripping suspicion into her son's mind. What kind of daughter-in-law lets her husband work himself to the bone, while she earns a pitiful salary? A woman who doesn't know how to yield will sooner or later tear a family apart. Laura heard it all, but she didn't respond. She told me, "Mom, I choose silence not because I've lost, but because I don't want Jacob to grow up in a house filled only with fights." I listened, understanding that her restraint was also a kind of strength. But I also worried that those drops of poison would, little by little, seep into Brian. Then it happened one night when Jacob had a high fever. Laura hurriedly held her son in her arms, while Brian frantically searched for the insurance papers to take him to the doctor. In the rush, he opened the drawer where Laura kept some documents, alongside the insurance file. His eyes fell on a thick envelope. He pulled it out, and before him were enormous donation receipts, all bearing my name, Susan Walker. Laura said that when she walked into the room, she saw Brian frozen, his eyes fixed on those papers. He turned to her, his voice hoarse. "What is this? Why did you never tell me? Your mother, where did she get this kind of money?" Startled, Laura quickly gathered the papers. "This isn't what matters right now. Jacob needs the hospital immediately," she said, trying to deflect him. Brian stayed silent, carrying their son out to the car, but Laura could clearly see her husband's gaze had changed. In his eyes was not only worry for Jacob, but also a heavy shadow, the shadow of suspicion. As Laura recounted this to me, I could hear her sigh over the phone. She didn't cry, but her voice tightened. Mom, I'm so scared. I'm afraid he'll think everything I've worked for is just a fade. That we've been living off you all along. I sat speechless, my hand gripping the receiver tightly. I knew this moment had come, the moment when the secret I had kept for years began to fracture. And in the darkness of the night, I imagined Brian's eyes clouded over, as if a door of doubt had just opened, pushing that little family onto an uncertain path. Laura called me late one evening, after Jacob had fallen asleep. Her voice was soft, as if afraid the sound might leak out and someone would overhear. Mom, he asked me a question I never thought I'd hear. I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. He looked me straight in the eye and asked, "Who is your family, really?" Laura said at first she was stunned. That question wasn't mere curiosity, it carried both suspicion and distance. Brian no longer looked at her as his partner in life, but as a mystery to be unraveled. She took a deep breath, then answered her husband without looking away. You want the truth, but are you ready for it? Because once you choose to go all the way, there will be no turning back. Brian said nothing. He only stared at his wife for a long moment, his eyes caught between frustration and unease, then walked out without another word. Laura heard the door close softly, and with it, her heart closed too. From that day on, Brian changed completely. He no longer asked questions or conversed like before. He simply watched in silence. At night, while Laura busied herself playing with Jacob, Brian pretended to scroll on his phone but was secretly searching for information about charities in the area. Once, he dug through old newspapers, scanning every line about anonymous donations to hospitals and churches. Laura said she saw her husband's eyes growing darker, like someone wandering deeper into a labyrinth of suspicion. She knew Brian was quietly investigating, but she didn't say anything. The more she explained, the more it might look like concealment. As I listened to my daughter, my heart ached with fear. I knew that feeling well, when love faces the test of suspicion, even the smallest gap can turn into an abyss. Laura paused for a long time, then whispered, Mom, I've never felt him so distant. He sleeps in the same bed, but it's as if he lives in another world. I sat silently in my dark kitchen, pressing my hand against my chest to steady my racing heart. I understood the real storm had begun, and this time, none of us could avoid it. Laura told me that in the days that followed, the air in the house felt heavy, like stones pressing down. Brian stayed silent, while Jana grew unusually lively. She seized every chance to drip more poison, this time no longer about money or daily burdens, but stabbing straight at the mystery surrounding my family. At one dinner, Jana picked up a piece of meat for Brian and dropped a remark, half joking, half serious. Son, don't let yourself be blinded. If your wife were truly honest, she wouldn't dodge every mention of her mother. You'd better expose her now before it's too late to regret. Laura, sitting opposite, froze with her chopsticks midair. She told me she didn't respond, she only looked at Brian. But Brian didn't look at his wife. His eyes were fixed on his bowl of rice, silent enough to make the whole table go cold. That night, Laura called me. Her voice trembled, part anger, part sorrow. Mom, she said that straight to my face. I could see in his eyes that suspicion has already taken root. I don't know what to do anymore. I gripped the receiver, my heart tightening. I knew this was the turning point. The whispers of before had now become open blades. And the worst thing was that Brian, in his exhaustion and doubt, was letting the blade cut deeper into his own trust. Laura added softly, Mom, I'm not afraid of hardship, but I'm afraid one day he'll believe her completely and turn his back on me. I could only reply gently, keep your heart steady. Sometimes the truth needs time to speak for itself. But when I hung up, I sat still for a long time, a sense of helplessness surrounding me. A few days later, Laura realized Brian had begun acting strangely. He made excuses for coming home late, but in reality he was circling the neighborhood where I lived. At times, he stood far off across the street, watching my small house. Laura found out because a neighbor happened to mention seeing a young man standing and looking at that house all afternoon. When Laura told me, her voice caught. "Mom, he's watching you." I sat frozen, staring at my trembling hands. After so many years of living quietly in simplicity, I had never imagined this day would come, the day my own son-in-law would trace my footsteps, not with trust, but with suspicion. That day, Nancy came to visit me. The two of us old women sat on the porch, sipping tea, talking about things that seemed harmless. But that peaceful afternoon became the moment my secret was exposed. I had no idea that, from the far corner of the street, Brian had been quietly watching. Dressed in his office clothes, he stood hidden beneath a tree, like a man desperate to solve the riddle that had haunted his mind. Nancy looked at me, her voice gentle. "Susan, you've done so much for this community. The hospital, the school, the scholarship fund. Everyone knows there's an anonymous benefactor, but no one ever guessed it was you. When will you tell Laura?" I set my teacup down and sighed. I don't need anyone to know. As long as Laura can live a normal life, not tied to the shadow of money. The rest, I'll just let it all be as it is. Those seemingly light words all reached Brian's ears. Laura told me that evening, when her husband came home, his face was pale. He shut the door, laid down the stack of donation receipts he had secretly kept on the table, and looked at her, his voice shaking but full of anger. "I heard everything. Your mother is the one behind those massive donations. Why did you hide it from me? How long were you planning to let me live in this lie?" Laura froze, but she didn't run. She lifted her head, her voice strangely calm. "Why do you think I hid it? I didn't want our love to turn into a debt. If you knew my mother had money, you would always doubt my feelings for you. I only wanted us to start from nothing, so you'd know I came to you for love, not for anything else." Brian was stunned. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair, his breathing harsh. "But you deceived me. All this time, I carried everything on my shoulders, while you just stayed silent." Laura replied, her tone low but firm. "I was never silent. I worked. I raised our child. I fought every day. I didn't bring my mother's money into this, because I respect you and our marriage. If that's still considered deceit, then I can't change that." When I heard Laura recount that exchange, my heart twisted. My daughter, once again, had to endure the anger that should have been directed at me, the one who should have explained. Yet at the same time, I felt pride slippin'. Laura hadn't begged, nor shifted blame. She chose to hold the truth in her own way, even if it brought her pain. Laura said the air in the room had grown so heavy it felt like it could be cut into pieces. Before Brian could say another word, Jeanne walked in. She must have overheard part of the conversation from the hallway, because she didn't hesitate to jump in, her voice sharp. "I told you already. She isn't sincere. She and her mother are only good at hiding things, leaving you to break your back. Now do you see it clearly?" Laura lifted her head, her eyes bright and unnervingly calm. She didn't raise her voice, didn't tremble. She simply spoke each word with precision. I live honestly. I don't need to prove that to you. Jeanne froze, her eyes widening as if she couldn't believe her daughter-in-law dared to speak like that. For a moment, the living room went utterly silent. From the next room, Jacob began to cry softly, the sound only making the silence heavier, more suffocating. Laura bent down to pick up her child, then turned back, her voice still steady. I love Brian not for money, not for this house, and certainly not for your approval. I chose silence because I thought the family needed peace. But if you think silence means deceit, then I have nothing more to explain. Brian stood between the two women, his face pale. He didn't look at his wife, nor could he meet his mother's eyes. His steps moved slowly, as if he wanted to escape the room but couldn't find the way out. Laura said she had never seen her husband so shaken. He paced back and forth, tugged at his hair, then stood frozen by the window. Words seemed stuck in his throat, unable to come out. Jeanne exhaled sharply, her lips pressed tight, her eyes glinting with a mix of irritation and satisfaction. She thought her son had finally seen the true face of his wife. But Laura no longer looked at her mother-in-law. She sat down, holding Jacob in her arms, her eyes fixed on the darkened window outside. When she told me about it later, her voice didn't tremble. It was indifferent, almost cold. Mom, in that moment I realized that if I had to prove every breath, every action, then this marriage no longer had meaning. I chose to hold on to the truth for myself, whether anyone believes it or not. On my end, I sat in silence. I knew that conversation had left a deep crack in her small family. And Brian, the man who was supposed to be her anchor, had now become the most unsettled of all. Laura ended the story with a sigh. He stayed silent, Mom. So silent it scared me. I don't know if that silence is a storm waiting to break, or if it means he's beginning to see something deeper. I closed my eyes, imagining my son-in-law's face, confused eyes, lips moving but unable to form words. And I understood. That silence was the most dangerous space of all, where love could either collapse or be saved. Laura told me that the next morning, as sunlight streamed through the curtains, the heaviness in the house lingered just as it had the night before. Brian stayed silent through breakfast, but when Jeanne left the table to go into the kitchen, he suddenly slammed his coffee cup down, his voice bursting out as though he had held back too long. You don't trust me, do you, Laura? If you did, you would have told me the truth from the beginning. Do you think I'm so weak that I couldn't handle knowing your mother has money? Laura paused, looking straight at her husband. She said in that moment, she could feel her heart pounding, but her voice stayed calm, firm. I trust you, Brian, but I don't trust that your pride is strong enough not to turn it into a burden. I stayed silent because I wanted to protect your dignity, not because I looked down on you. Brian froze. His eyes flared, burning with both anger and the sting of a wound laid bare. The long nights of exhaustion, the whispers from Jeanne, all pressing down. And now his wife had spoken so directly. Just then, Jeanne emerged from the kitchen, catching the last words. She immediately shrieked, her voice shrill as if to drown out everything else. My son has been deceived. He works himself to the bone, while you sit there spouting clever words. If you're honest, why hide it? Why let everyone think you're just a penniless office girl? Laura told me she held Jacob tightly in her arms, her eyes fixed on Jeanne. She didn't lash back in anger, but kept silent, as though saving her reply for another time. Yet in her eyes, I knew my daughter had made her choice. She would no longer live to please her mother-in-law. When Laura recounted this to me over the phone, her voice sank lower, trembling slightly. but I could hear a growing pride within it. She was no longer the daughter who used to call me in tears. Now she dared to stand tall, facing both husband and mother-in-law with her own voice. Sitting alone in my little kitchen, I ached for what Laura had to endure, yet whispered to myself, "My daughter has truly grown up." Laura said that after Jeanette's outburst. The room sank into a heavy silence. Jacob shifted in his mother's arms, his wide eyes darting between the three adults. Laura gently stroked his back, then lifted her head, her voice low but resolute. "No one has deceived anyone. I chose silence to keep the family together. I didn't want everything to turn into calculations about money, or for anyone to think this love had a price tag. I believe that as long as we trust each other, we can overcome anything." Her words rose in the air, slow but unwavering, like a truth no one could deny. Jeanne stood still for a few seconds, her face pale, while Brian stared at his wife in shock. He had never imagined the woman he once thought fragile could speak with such strength. Laura said Brian looked as if he were about to speak, but then pressed his lips shut, unable to utter a word. He only stepped back, his trembling hands gripping the chair, his eyes fixed on Laura as though seeing a completely different person from the quiet, gentle wife he had always known. When Laura told me this, her voice was low, but in every word I heard an unfamiliar maturity. She was no longer sobbing or choking back tears, but speaking like a woman who knew exactly what she was holding on to. I sat in my small kitchen, my hands trembling as I clutched the receiver, a swell of indescribable pride rising within me. My daughter had chosen the harder path: silence, patience, and then speaking up at the precise moment to defend her marriage. She hadn't avoided, nor shifted blame, but openly admitted her silence had been a choice. "I don't know if he fully understands," Laura whispered, "but at least I said it. And if this love can stand, it has to stand on that truth." I closed my eyes and drew a long breath. In that moment, I sensed that Brian, even in his doubt, had seen something undeniable. His wife was not weak, and that very strength, perhaps, would be what decided whether their marriage would shatter or be saved. I knew I could no longer stay silent. All this time, I had chosen to stand aside, letting Laura face her trials on her own. But now, when suspicion had gone too far, I understood it was time to speak. That afternoon, Laura invited me over. The atmosphere in the living room was heavy. Jeanne sat with her arms crossed, her eyes challenging. Brian stood near the window, his face tense. Laura sat beside them, holding Jacob in her arms, her eyes steady but tinged with weariness. I drew a long breath, stood tall, and looked Jeanne straight in the eye. My voice was calm but rang out clear. "Laura is rich not because of money, but because of her heart. She is strong and kind, because from childhood she learned that the true worth of a person does not lie in possessions, but in how they treat others." Jeanne raised her brows, ready to reply, but I lifted my hand to stop her and continued. "I have lived simply all my life. When my husband died young, I didn't choose to lean on others or to boast. I worked, I saved, and I gave most of that money to those who needed it more than I did. From charity meals for the homeless to scholarships for poor children, I did it all in silence, not for praise, but so my conscience could rest in peace." I turned to Brian, meeting his eyes, still clouded with doubt. "You think Laura and I hid things to deceive you?" "No. We stayed silent because we wanted my daughter to live as an ordinary woman, to love and be loved, without the shadow of money cast over her." Brian stood still, his lips parting but no words coming out. Clearly, this was the first time he saw me not as the quiet, middle-class widow he had assumed, but in an entirely different light. Laura sat quietly, her hands tightening around Jacob, her eyes shimmering as if she might cry, but her lips pressed together in pride. And Jana, she tilted her head, her lips pursed, her eyes flashing with a rare uncertainty. She had not expected me to rise and confront her this way. I knew my words that day would not be enough to change everything, but at the very least, I had laid the truth on the table, so no one could use vagueness as a weapon to divide them anymore. The air in the living room seemed frozen after I finished speaking. Jana sat there, her face flushed, her eyes flickering. Clearly, she had not expected me to stand up and face her so directly. Yet her ingrained pride would not allow her to back down. You speak well, Jana sneered softly. But tell me, if you truly wanted the best for your daughter, why hide it for so many years? Who could believe it was all just out of kindness? I answered calmly, because not everything needs to be displayed. I wanted Laura to grow up through her own efforts. I chose silence not to deceive, but to show her that her worth does not lie in her mother's bank balance. Jana didn't reply immediately. She pressed her lips together, then turned away, pretending to adjust the scarf on her shoulders. I could see the unease in her every movement, though she still refused to admit she was wrong. At that moment, Laura set Jacob down in the crib, then came to stand beside me. She clasped my hand tightly, warm, trembling. I looked up and saw her eyes brimming with tears, yet glowing with pride. She turned to the others, lifted her head high, and said clearly, "My mother has lived this way all her life, quiet, kind, without the need to boast. If that is wrong, then I am proud to have learned that wrong from her." I squeezed her hand, tears streaming down my face, but my heart filled with pride. For years, I had worried Laura would collapse under the weight of pressure, but now she stood tall, firmly defending herself and me. I glanced at Brian. He leaned against the wall, shoulders slumped, face pale. His eyes, fixed on the two of us, revealed his shame. He lowered his head, as if unable to face the wife who had endured so much with strength, and the mother-in-law he had once doubted. Laura said nothing more, only held my hand tighter. That small gesture was enough for me to know my daughter was strong enough to keep going, no matter how stormy the road ahead might be. Laura told me that after that day, Brian seemed to sink into silence. There were no more harsh questions, no more reproachful words. He still went to work on time, still came home punctually, but dinner unfolded in quiet, filled only with the clink of spoons on bowls and Jacob's babbling filling the empty space. In the evenings, Brian often sat for a long time at the desk, his eyes fixed on nothing. Laura many times opened her mouth to speak, then stopped, leaving him alone inside his own thoughts. "I feel like there's an invisible wall between us," Laura said slowly. But silence did not mean indifference. In that stillness, Brian began to remember every moment with his wife. He remembered the mornings when Laura rushed out, carrying both Jacob and her work bag, her tired smile never turning into complaint. He remembered the nights Jacob was sick, Laura staying up until dawn, yet dressing neatly for work without adding to his worries. He remembered even Jeanette's barbed remarks, and how Laura always smiled back, responding with a rare calmness. Memory after memory poured in, and gradually Brian realized the woman who had stood beside him all these years had never once given up. If anyone had been blinded, it was himself for letting whispers become truth in his own mind. One evening, Laura quietly brought Brian a small box. Inside was an old letter her father had left before he passed. She placed it in front of her husband, her voice gentle but clear. Read it. This is what my father wanted to leave for our family." Brian opened the letter. Lines of shaky yet warm handwriting appeared. "My dear daughter, money can build a house, but it cannot keep a home. What holds a family together is not wealth, but trust. When you know how to trust the person beside you, then even if you lose everything, you will not lose yourself." Laura sat across from him, her eyes steady. "I've kept this letter for many years. Today, I'm giving it to you because I believe we need it now more than ever." Brian reached the last line, his hand clutching the paper, his lips trembling. In his eyes, Laura was no longer just the wife he had doubted, but the thread holding on to the trust slipping from his grasp. Laura said that when Brian finished reading the letter, his hands shook so much the paper nearly fell to the floor. He looked up, his eyes red, staring at his wife for a long time as if trying to find again the woman he had loved from the very beginning. Then suddenly, he stepped forward and pulled Laura tightly into his arms. His voice broke, shattering into pieces. "I'm sorry, Laura. I've made you bear too much. I let the whispers get into my head. I forgot that you were always here, carrying everything with me." Laura stayed quiet, her small shoulders trembling in her husband's embrace. But she didn't break down like someone finally vindicated. Instead, she only answered softly, her voice steady and full of yearning. "All I need is for you to trust me, Brian. With that trust, we can overcome anything." Her words made Brian weep harder. He clung to his wife as if afraid that letting go would mean losing her forever. Nearby, Jacob saw his parents hugging and toddled over, wrapping his little arms around their legs and laughing brightly. His childish giggles rang out, a warm note breaking through the wall of silence that had surrounded the family for so long. Laura said that at that moment, Jana stepped out from the kitchen. She froze at the doorway, eyes wide as she saw her son crying in his wife's arms. For years, she had looked at Laura as an outsider, someone who had to constantly prove herself in this household. But in that instant, Jana seemed to see something different. Her face softened, her lips quivered, and then, in the heavy silence, a single tear slid down her cheek. Laura told me it was the first time she had ever seen her mother-in-law cry. No one spoke. There was only Brian's sobs, Laura's heartbeat, and Jacob's innocent laughter. Together, they blended into something fragile, yet truly the sound of a family. Laura told me that the next morning, breakfast in the house was completely different from every other day. It was no longer filled with heavy silence, nor with noisy quarrels. The atmosphere carried something unfamiliar, as if everyone was groping to find a new place for themselves. Jana set the food on the table. Brian sat down, and Laura held Jacob beside her. For a moment, breakfast passed peacefully, until Jana dropped a remark, half reproach, half challenge. "Brian, you must remember what I taught you since you were little. Never let anyone get the better of you." In the past, Brian would have stayed silent, or sometimes nodded to let it pass. But this time, he put his spoon down, looked straight at his mother, his voice calm but firm. "Mom, Laura is not getting the better of me. She is my wife. She carries the load with me every day. Only I never took the time to really see it. I won't allow anyone, not even you, to belittle her anymore." Laura told me her heart clenched when she heard those words. It was the first time Brian openly stood by his wife in front of his mother. Jana froze, her eyes flashing with surprise. She turned to her daughter-in-law, her gaze still sharp but lacking the certainty it once held. Laura set Jacob down in the high chair, then turned back to look at both mother and son. Her voice was gentle, not raised, but each word clear. I don't need a judge who is always scrutinizing and condemning. I need a partner to walk together through hardships. If we keep looking at each other with suspicion, then this house will never be a home." Her words brought the room into silence. Jana pressed her lips together, her hands clasped on the table. No one knew what she was thinking, but in her eyes, the stubbornness so often seen had softened a little. Brian quietly turned to look at his wife, his face relaxing, his eyes warm with a trace of shame. He reached out and took Laura's hand, as if to affirm that this time he would not leave her alone again. Laura said that was the moment she knew everything was beginning to change. Jana had not fully accepted it, but for the first time, she did not respond with attack. Her shoulders lowered, her face less tense, as if a crack had appeared in her heart to let the truth in. Laura told me that the instant Brian gently held her hand, the air in the room was still tense, but no longer suffocating as before. Jacob, as if sensing the change, suddenly clapped his hands and shouted, "Mom and Dad are smiling." The child's clear voice rang out, making all three adults burst into laughter. The laughter was not long, not loud, but enough to chase away the coldness that had blanketed the house for so many months. Laura said that was the moment she saw Brian truly return to her side. His eyes no longer avoided hers, no longer clouded with suspicion, but were the eyes of the man who once promised to walk with her. Jana also sat quietly, not uttering another bitter word. Though she had not completely changed, the familiar frown had softened, and in her eyes flickered a trace of gentleness Laura had never seen before. When she told me, Laura's voice was clearer than ever. She said to me over the phone, half laughing, half trembling, "Mom, at last I feel I don't have to fight alone anymore. I've waited for this moment for so long." I sat in my small kitchen, listening to my daughter's happiness, my eyes blurred with tears. For so many years, I had watched Laura endure with strength and patience, holding on to her home. And now, she was finally answered with true companionship from the husband she loved. Jacob babbled over the phone, laughing gleefully. Laura turned on the speaker, letting me hear my grandson's tender little voice calling, "Grandma." My heart felt light, as if a great burden had just been lifted. Laura said that as the morning sunlight poured through the window, the whole kitchen seemed to glow. That light was not only from the sun, but like a new beginning, where everyone in that house could learn to live together, without needing to claim victory over one another. Hearing this, I smiled softly. At last, after so many storms, a ray of light had truly shone into my daughter's life, and I knew this was only the beginning of a better chapter ahead. As I sit before a blank page to write this story, I, Susan Walker, realize that all the stormy days have taught us something very simple. Happiness does not come from the money in the bank, but from trust and the way we hold on to each other. I once kept a fortune hidden, not to boast, but to protect my daughter from the judgmental eyes of the world. But then I understood, no secret can last forever, and when it is revealed, only character and love are strong enough to keep a family standing. We chose simplicity to preserve what is most precious, character and love. That is what I want to leave behind, not only for Laura, for Brian, but also for little Jacob in the future. Now, I see that Laura's family has changed. No longer are their meals drowned in silence and mockery. Brian sits closer to his wife, his eyes gentle when he looks at Laura. Jana, though still reserved, has stopped her biting remarks. Some days, she quietly holds Jacob, letting the child clutch her finger, her eyes softening as if there had never been any distance at all. Laura told me that at last, she truly feels a home. She no longer has to prove her worth. Because Brian has understood. The woman beside him is stronger than any wealth. And he himself has realized that if love is not built on trust, then every possession becomes meaningless. Hearing my daughter recount this, my heart welled up. All the sacrifices, the tears, the days I worried in silence, were finally answered with one word: reunion. That family had learned a precious lesson. Money may make life easier, but only trust can keep us together. Elora said that on a warm afternoon, the whole family gathered in the living room. Jacob had just learned to run steadily, his little feet scampering everywhere, his mouth full of laughter. The boy ran around the table, clutching his toy car, occasionally turning back to call Mama, Daddy, before bursting into giggles again. That clear laughter spread through the house, filling every corner, as if to erase all the tense days that had passed. I sat beside them, my heart at ease. Seeing my daughter radiant and my grandchild healthy, I felt that all those years of silent endurance and protection had finally been repaid. Then Laura stepped toward Brian, holding a small wooden box. She smiled and handed it to her husband. This is the wedding gift my mother prepared for us long ago, but I wanted to keep it until today to give it to you. Brian opened the box. Inside was a gleaming key. He looked up, his eyes filled with surprise. What kind of key is this? Laura gently squeezed his hand. It's the key to the house my mother bought for us before the wedding. She kept it hidden because I didn't want you to think my love was tied to any possession. I wanted us to start from nothing together, so you could see my heart clearly. Brian held the key, his hand trembling. He looked at me, then back at his wife. His eyes reddened, his voice choked. It isn't this house. It's your love that has held me. I almost lost the most precious thing in my life. Laura smiled, tears shimmering at the corners of her eyes. She leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, while Jacob kept running around, his laughter ringing like the melody of a home that had just found peace again. I sat there, watching the scene, feeling as if time had slowed. One part of my life had closed, but a new part had opened for my daughter, my son-in-law, and my grandson. And now, I want to ask you, the one listening to this story, a simple yet important question. If it were you, would you choose to flaunt wealth or to preserve simple happiness? My dear friends, if this story has touched your heart, I invite you to leave a comment and share your thoughts or your own experiences. And don't forget to subscribe so we can continue to listen, to tell, and to live through stories together, stories that may be yours, or perhaps someone you once knew.